Assassin's Creed Odyssey is one of the most divisive AC titles out there. It has the fan base divided as to whether it should even be called an Assassin's Creed, considering that it takes place about 400 years before Origins and before the actual assassins or hidden ones were even a thing. Others say that it doesn't matter when or where the game takes place because this franchise has always been about exploring historical periods first and foremost, and should not be limited to its name. The truth is simply that the Assassin's Creed franchise has evolved and changed, most notably with Origins, which changed pretty much everything, from combat to movement to stealth to parkour and so on. However, one could argue that the real change came with AC Black Flag, which is seen as one, if not the best game in the franchise. Yet, Black Flag, just like Odyssey, had very little to do with actual assassins. And I'm bringing this up because there are purists in the community who constantly complain and whine about how none of the current AC games have anything to do with assassins and Templars. But if we're being honest, AC Black Flag was a pirate simulator for about 80% of the game, yet they usually have no problem with this one, but when it comes to Odyssey, their heads explode. The Assassin's Creed franchise has changed and will never come back to its roots. It will never again be like the games before Origins. The reason for this is simply the fact that these games, in their current form, are making more money than they ever have. With so many people buying them, there is little reason for Ubisoft to change the current formula. Out of all this emerges AC Odyssey, the most divisive game Ubisoft ever put out, and the best Assassin's Creed game they ever made. Assassin's Creed Odyssey follows the story of Alexios or Cassandra, depending on which one of the two siblings you're going to choose at the beginning of the game. This is the first game in the franchise that allows you to choose your playable character, or rather, whether you want to play as male or female. Both of them have the exact same lines and script, but different voice actors, and certain plot points will be slightly different. Most notably, the relation you have with your sibling. Other than that, nothing changes. There are no extra quests if you choose to play male or female. Personally, I chose Alexios just because armor looks much better on him, and his voice actor did a perfect job in bringing a rough mercenary to life. Cassandra sounds too soft in my opinion, while Alexios sounds exactly how you would want a mercenary during the Peloponnesian War to sound like. When he gets angry, you hear testosterone pumping and just expect him to Spartan kick someone off a cliff. Alexios is a mercenary that works in Kefalonia until he gets sucked into a web of intrigue, drama, political machinations, and war. Sparta and Athens are constantly at each other's throat, and you can feel the tension that's in the air every time you enter a city that is either being besieged or not far from the battlefield. You'll find beaches full of dead soldiers or peasants, many of them impaled on stakes or mutilated or burned. All the while, you're surrounded by one of the most beautiful worlds in any AC game. During the story, Alexios will fight for both sides and slowly begin to question his loyalties, since he himself is Spartan and the grandson of the great Leonidas, who died with his 300 Spartans. Unfortunately, I can't say more about the story without spoilers, but this story feels exactly like an Odyssey, that much I can tell you. There is grief, pain, humor, war, blood, sex and gore. All the good stuff you'd want to see. Odyssey has one of the best stories in the entire franchise. All the characters get the right amount of screen time, and there are some really good plot twists, especially involving the cult of Cosmos. Out of all AC games, Odyssey has the best gameplay. That's the way I see it. This game is the height and culmination of the entire franchise. Origins set the scene and changed pretty much everything, while Odyssey improved even more on Origins' system. And this is very impressive, considering how Origins already had one of the best gameplay and especially combat systems next to Unity. Although it is important to say that Odyssey only improved slightly, just enough to feel like an upgrade, but not too much. There wasn't that much to improve anyway, as Origins was already one of the best games in the franchise. Despite that, combat feels smoother than ever. You're fast, finishers look awesome, and it's all about timing. Since your enemies level up with you, you'll never be able to just rush them, unless you're fighting in an area that is multiple levels below you. Your enemies can be just as deadly as you, and sometimes it'll take multiple tries to defeat them, especially if you're fighting other mercenaries. The mercenary system in Odyssey works similar to the Nemesis system in Shadow of War. These mercenaries are randomly generated with some legendary exceptions and will come after you depending on how famous you become or how much chaos you cause. Because in this game, unlike in its predecessors, you are able to kill civilians. You can go full GTA here and just massacre whole villages and cities. Although I probably should mention that the NPCs in this game often aren't as stupid as they look. Many of them will actually arm themselves and go after you as a mob if you start running amok. The more innocent people you kill, the higher the bounty on your head will become, and that's where the mercenaries come in. The higher your bounty, the more powerful the mercenary. And let me tell you something, some of these guys are no joke. Even if you have powerful gear, these assholes will fuck you up real good if you're not careful. Some of the fights I had with them literally felt like Dark Souls boss fights, and in some cases I had to leave my balls behind and get the fuck out of there. One way you can deal with your bounty is by simply paying it off, or by killing so-called sponsors. These are people that put the bounty on you in the first place, and they are often well guarded. Killing them, however, especially if you're doing it quietly while being stealthy, really makes you feel like an assassin. Which brings me to my next point, people claiming that this is not a real Assassin's Creed game. Odyssey is a real Assassin's Creed game. People claiming that it isn't usually either haven't played it, or are old school purists, or just hate the fact that it plays long before the Assassins existed. Ever since the game released, I've heard so many people complaining about how it's not a real AC game, so many people whining and seemingly not understanding how the gaming industry or gaming evolution works, even though the Cult of Cosmos makes this the most AC the series has ever been in a long time. So let me break things down and explain some basic facts. First of all, video games are always evolving and changing. These changes can be good or bad, but whether you like them or not doesn't matter at all in most cases. In fact, I'd go so far and say that it pretty much never matters, and the only time your opinion will have any impact on a game is when it turns out to be completely broken or buggy, or a blatant lie, and that it's not at all like it was advertised. Great examples of this are games like AC Unity, Cyberpunk 2077, and No Man's Sky. Although Unity is a great game at the end of the day, probably one of the best, if not the best AC game of the older generation. Which is strange to say, considering it's only 6 years old at this point. But when things like that happen, gamers come together as a collective and just straight up refuse to buy those games, demand refunds, and unleash a shitstorm of epic proportions. This happened to Ubisoft with Unity, When the game was released completely broken and unplayable. As a game, it wasn't bad, but it just ran like shit and people were upset that they had to pay $60 for an unfinished product. Adding to that, as much as I like Unity and the older AC games, at the end of the day, they started to feel very samey. They were basically the same games with only minor changes with each release. In Syndicate, you were doing the same things you did in Unity. In Unity, you did the same things as in Black Flag minus the ship battles. Gamers were just sick of this Ubisoft formula and it forced them to reinvent the whole series. The result of which would be Assassin's Creed Origins. Now, I am not a blind idiot. Regardless of my love for Origins and Odyssey, I will not pretend that these games are not repetitious. But this whole argument about them being repetitious is just idiotic considering how all AC titles have repetition in them. Odyssey gets a lot of shit for that, but it's by far not the first one to do this. Ubisoft's whole open world concept, whether AC or Far Cry or modern Ghost Recon, stands on the shoulders of a system that pretty much forces you to do the same things over and over again until you either burn out or complete everything there is to complete. So, in that sense alone, Odyssey is the true embodiment of an Assassin's Creed game. Next, let's talk about the claim that this game has nothing to do with the actual core story of the franchise. This couldn't be further from the truth. You have Assassins, you have the Cult of Cosmos, which is a predecessor of the Order of the Ancients, which in turn is a predecessor of the Templars. You have Isu artifacts and Apples of Eden, which are implemented in a very interesting way. You have parkour and can climb pretty much everything you can see. And of course, you have a stealth system. A simple one, but let's be honest, AC titles never had a very complex stealth system. These are all qualities that have made AC titles real Assassin's Creed games in the past, but here some people seem to get way too butthurt. They think that just because you're not wearing a hood, that you're not a real assassin. Because, as we all know, wearing a hood apparently makes you invisible and that you can't be a decent assassin without a hood. Odyssey is the first game in the franchise to feature mythological creatures in the main game as non-DLC content. Yes, Origins had some elements too, but most of these were drug-induced hallucinations, and I'm not counting the DLCs right now because they're not part of the main game. In Assassin's Creed Odyssey, you get the chance of finding and fighting multiple Greek mythological creatures such as Medusa, the Minotaur, the Cyclops, and the Sphinx. All of them have their own quests that you first have to discover or stumble upon, and all of them are deeply connected to ancient Greek lore and to Isu lore. In my opinion, these creatures are easily one of the biggest highlights in the entire game and one of the reasons why you should buy it. No other game will actually make you feel like Odysseus or a Greek hero traveling the ancient world and sea, discovering old ruins and monsters. It straight up feels like a story taken right from the Iliad itself. See, at the end of the day, all of what I'm saying in this video is my opinion. I'm not trying to insult anyone who doesn't agree with me, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this game and why you agree or disagree with me, as long as you keep it civil. But to me, Assassin's Creed Odyssey is a marvel of a video game, and in general, it seems like we take the whole franchise for granted, regardless of its flaws. Ask yourself, how many other games give you the chance of visiting a highly detailed ancient Egypt or Greece, or that you fight like a musketeer in revolutionary Paris alongside Napoleon? And I could go on and on. Now, I'm not a Ubisoft fanboy, not even close. I absolutely hate Valhalla, and I think that it indeed is the worst game in the series. But at the same time, I see why some people may like it and why there is such hype surrounding it. Assassin's Creed Odyssey is one of those games that will forever divide the community and incite arguments. It's like Batman Origins, a great game that had a rocky launch and just came out at the wrong time. I hope you enjoyed this video. Leave a like and maybe subscribe. It'll help me grow and make even better content. I'd also love for you to leave some constructive criticism about what I could do better in future videos. With that said, have a great day until next time.